1636, winter. A single, brown, dormant flower bulb that looks like nothing more than a dry, ordinary onion suddenly holds enough value to purchase a grand canalside house in the heart of Amsterdam. That is the waking dream of 1636.
And during the winter of 1636, we're talking about a society completely in love. The Dutch Republic wasn't some backwater. It was Europe's absolute wealthiest, most commercially sophisticated society of bankers and merchants, and they fell, collectively, head over heels in love with the flower from the Ottoman Empire. Out in the cool, damp soil of the Low Countries, tulips just flourished, and unlike almost anything else growing at the time, they bloomed in these crazy, vivid, hyper-saturated colors. It totally captivated a society that was suddenly flush with unbelievable cash. Just one. That is the number of prized blooms it took to equal an entire Grand Amsterdam estate. Now, keep in mind, they weren't trading for gold or silk or rare overseas spices. We're talking about an unstoppable market momentum taking over a population that had grown so comfortable, so wealthy, that they were perfectly willing to drop incredible fortunes on pure luxury and pure beauty. But to really grasp this frenzy, we have to look past the money and look closely at the flower itself. Because right at the core of all this wealth is a massive, profound biological irony, an invisible virus. See, the market was obsessed with what were called broken tulips. These were stunningly beautiful, highly prized flowers that had these dramatic, feather-like flames of contrasting colors streaking wildly intricate patterns across their petals. Nothing else looked like it. But here's the catch. They were maddeningly unpredictable. The growers literally couldn't reproduce them on demand. The secret of the petals was basically a botanical lottery. Coveted varieties had to be discovered completely by chance, and then they propagated incredibly slowly through offsets of the parent bulb. But here's the craziest part, the ultimate surprise. That dramatic, highly coveted streaking, it was an infection. The most valuable asset in the entire world was literally carrying a plant virus. It's like paying millions for a masterpiece painting, only to find out the paint is only glowing because it's actively rotting. And nobody would even discover this biological fact for centuries. So, with these super rare, diseased bulbs practically impossible to cultivate quickly, the mechanics of buying and selling them had to mutate. That's how we got massive paper fortunes built entirely on futures trading. Think about the Tavern chain. The actual bulb is lying dormant in the freezing dirt, right? It can only be dug up during a really short window in the year. So the trading moved indoors to smoky, crowded pubs. You'd write up a promissory note in a tavern. Then you'd sell that paper contract to the next speculator who planned to flip it again. You had guys in there who had absolutely zero intention of ever getting their hands dirty or actually planting a flower. They were just trading paper. And as that chain got longer and longer, the price completely detached from the physical plant. By the peak of the frenzy in early 1637, this got totally out of hand. The chain of contracts had stretched so far that people were literally signing away parcels of real estate, livestock, their furniture, and family silver just for celebrated bulbs with fancy names like Semper Augustus or the Viceroy. One slip of paper was being exchanged for years of a skilled craftsman's wages. There were literally stories of ordinary tradesmen tossing aside their tools and abandoning their daily work just to day trade flowers. And then the spell breaks. Without any real warning, at what was supposed to be a completely routine bulb auction in the city of Haarlem in February of 1637, the entire illusion just shattered. Here's exactly how it went down in February 1637. At that Haarlem auction, buyers simply failed to appear. The bulbs just sat there, unsold at the astronomical prices everyone had come to expect. And, man, word spreads fast. Confidence evaporated with frightening speed. Because think about it, the whole logic of this market relied entirely on finding a greater fool, the next buyer who would pay more. Once that expectation vanished, the logic dissolved. It wasn't just a dip in the market, it was a vertical collapse. Prices plummeted to a tiny fraction of their peak in a matter of days. Overnight, guys who had eagerly signed these massive contracts right at the absolute height of the mania were suddenly staring at debts they could never possibly pay, all for plants that were suddenly worth practically nothing. Men holding those paper contracts faced the very real, very terrifying prospect of never getting paid at all. Now, the enduring myth is that an unprecedented vertical drop like that would just totally nuke the nation's economy. But history and reality often bring some pretty wild perspective shifts. Because here is the second massive surprise of the aftermath. The myth we're often told is this devastating tale of total national economic ruin and profound moral failure. But the reality? The courts basically just looked at this tangled mess of tavern contracts and refused to enforce them. They treated them as unenforceable gambling debts, which local authorities eventually just settled for pennies on the dollar. And the national prosperity? It continued completely undisturbed. The actual economic damage was heavily concentrated among a really small circle of dealers. The broader country barely even skipped a beat. Yet the memory of those few winter months really lingers. A flower bulb, dormant and unremarkable to the eye, carrying within it a virus no one could see. It leaves us with this incredibly haunting image. Europe's most sophisticated society trading away literal fortunes for a diseased lump of dirt in the freezing mud, utterly convinced that the guy next to them in the tavern would always pay more, right up until the morning when, suddenly, no one was.